there is a moment that arrives without warning, a soft distortion in the familiar pattern of thought, when something unnamed presses from beneath the ordinary surface and alters the texture of awareness. It does not announce itself with clarity, nor does it offer any immediate understanding. It simply appears like a slow tide rising inside the chest, reshaping the air, making each breath feel slightly misplaced. The world continues with its usual noise, but the internal rhythm falters, slipping into an odd syncopation that cannot be articulated, only endured. It is the faint suspicion that something essential has shifted, that the underlying fabric of self has loosened at one corner, allowing a draft of uncertainty to seep inward. In that shift, the mind strains to identify what has changed, reaching toward meanings that dissolve as soon as they near the surface, leaving only a lingering sense of displacement and the quiet awareness that whatever has begun will not easily be undone. The sensation deepens in ways that cannot be traced to any memory or event, expanding like an unseen bruise across the interior landscape. There is an urge to name it, to pin it to something concrete. Yet every attempt slides through empty space as though the emotion itself refuses containment. It moves with its own gravity, pulling thoughts out of alignment, bending the edges of perception into curves that were not there before. What once felt balanced begins to tilt, not violently, but with a patient inevitability, as though an invisible hand has shifted its weight onto the scale. The mind tries to stabilize itself, summoning the familiar markers of identity, but each of them feels slightly out of focus, as though remembered rather than lived. And in that subtle blur, the sense of estrangement grows, curling itself around every thought until it becomes difficult to separate the observer from what is being observed, the feeling from the one who is feeling it. As the inner horizon darkens, the sensation acquires a texture, something dense and almost tactile, pressing against the internal walls with a quiet insistence. It feels ancient, predating words, carried from some deep reservoir the mind rarely touches. It whispers not with sound but with displacement, as though rearranging the furniture of thought, while the conscious self looks on in confusion. Old assumptions tremble under its pressure. Familiar beliefs seem thinner, unable to fully shield against the weight of whatever is rising. The sensation threads itself through memory, tugging at distant moments, reshaping them with a faint shadow that was not there when they first occurred. It is as if the past is being reinterpreted by a version of the self that has just awakened and is now sifting through everything that once felt certain, searching for cracks. The deeper it spreads, the more it alters the perception of time. Moments feel elongated at their edges, stretched just enough to expose the silence between them. That silence carries its own resonance, a hum that seems to pulse from some chamber behind consciousness, urging attention without revealing purpose. Within that hum lies a question that cannot be spoken and yet demands contemplation, a question that reaches beyond language and instead coils itself around emotion. It becomes difficult to tell if the sensation is emerging from within or descending from some higher vantage, folding itself into awareness. The separation between self and sensation blurs further, until it becomes unclear whether the mind is experiencing something or becoming it. The familiar boundary between internal and external begins to erode, leaving only the shifting pressure of something that feels both intimate and impossibly distant, As the sensation intensifies, the inner landscape begins to distort, not in shape, but in meaning. What once served as stable markers of identity start to drift like untethered fragments. Memories lose their chronological order and reassemble themselves according to emotional weight rather than time. Small details that once seemed irrelevant take on a strange significance, while larger moments recede into the background, drained of their influence. The sense of continuity that usually binds the self together loosens, allowing fragments of forgotten thoughts to rise uninvited. These fragments carry a subtle chill, a reminder that the mind stores far more than it consciously acknowledges, and that much of it lies dormant until something awakens it. The sensation seems to know exactly where to press, touching the quiet spaces where memory and identity overlap, stirring them until they bleed into one another. With each internal shift, the awareness grows heavier, as though the sensation has wrapped itself around the core of the self and is slowly tightening its grasp. It is not painful, but it is inescapable, filling the inner silence with a deep vibration that resonates like a distant echo. This echo feels older than the mind that hears it, carrying tones of recognition without offering clarity. It suggests that something has been waiting, watching from within the folds of thought, waiting for the right moment to emerge. And when it does, it brings with it a recognition that feels both intimate and disorienting, as though a forgotten door inside the mind has opened to reveal a room that has always existed, even if it was never acknowledged. Entering that room feels inevitable, and yet the threshold brings an unease that settles in the bones, a whisper that once crossed, the mind cannot return to its previous shape. The boundaries of self continue to unravel, revealing layers that feel both familiar and foreign. The sensation moves differently now, not as an intruder, but as something claiming territory it had always owned. It threads itself through thoughts with a deliberate slowness, rewriting their tone, tinting even the simplest reflection with an undercurrent of dread. Identity begins to feel less like a solid structure and more like a collection of drifting impressions, each one shaped by forces long forgotten. The attempt to hold on to a central sense of self becomes exhausting, like gripping sand that slips through the fingers no matter how tightly one clings. The sensation seems to observe this struggle with a quiet inevitability, as though it understands the futility of resisting what has already begun. In its presence, the mind no longer feels like a sanctuary but a labyrinth, one whose walls rearrange themselves with each step taken deeper inside. A strange clarity emerges from the unraveling, a clarity that does not comfort but illuminates hidden corners that have long remained untouched. It reveals the small distortions tucked into everyday perception, the subtle ways the mind edits reality to maintain coherence. But coherence now feels fragile, vulnerable to the slightest tremor. The sensation pushes at these vulnerabilities, widening the cracks until the polished surface of thought begins to splinter. Through those fractures, something raw seeps through, something that resists simplification. It is not a truth in any conventional sense, but a realization that the mind is far more complex, far more layered than the identity it presents. This realization carries its own weight, settling like sediment in the deepest parts of awareness, thickening the internal atmosphere until each thought feels suspended in a slow-moving current of uncertainty. The internal descent becomes self-perpetuating, as though The sensation has woven itself into the mechanism of thought, turning each reflection into an invitation to sink further. The concept of self becomes porous, absorbing meanings that were never its own, dissolving boundaries that once felt immovable. Emotions blur together, losing their distinct shapes until they become a single, nameless weight pressing from within. There is a faint longing for the simplicity of earlier states, but that longing only highlights the distance that is formed, the way the mind has shifted into a space where clarity is no longer accessible. This space feels both hollow and heavy, as though filled with the shadows of thoughts that have not yet fully formed. The sensation thrives in this ambiguity, expanding until it seems to fill every available corner, leaving no room for anything that does not belong to its growing influence. As the descent continues, the sensation becomes less of an experience and more of an environment, reshaping the internal world into something dense and darkly reflective. Thoughts echo differently here, slower, elongated, carrying tones that seem to emerge from depths far beyond their origin. The self drifts like a fragile fragment suspended in a vast internal sea, unable to anchor itself to anything stable. The familiar desire for understanding dissolves under the weight of something far more primal, the recognition that not all feelings can be named, and that some exist solely to reveal the fault lines within the mind. Those fault lines widen with every moment spent in this shifting landscape, exposing layers of identity that feel increasingly detached, as though they belong to someone remembered rather than someone present. And in that widening, the sensation grows colder, more precise, tracing each fracture with an almost deliberate patience. The final movement of the descent is the quietest, marked not by intensity but by a slow, creeping stillness that settles into the deepest recesses of awareness. It is a stillness that feels less like peace and more like the moment before a thought vanishes entirely, leaving behind only its outline. Identity unravels into a faint whisper, a residual impression hovering in the darkness. The sensation becomes indistinguishable from the self, a presence that no longer presses from within but simply is, woven into the very structure of awareness. And in that moment, there is the faintest recognition that perhaps it was always there, waiting for the moment when the mind was quiet enough to notice its shape, waiting for the internal world to shift just enough for its full weight to be felt. That weight lingers, stretching the final threads of thought until they thin and fade, dissolving into the slow-turning atmosphere where something unexplainable continues to.